So in the past, I've looked at CSS custom properties and their ability to help us theme an application, a web application. But things in theory are never quite as clean as they end up being in practice. And I wanted to do some noodling on how I might take a legacy application that doesn't really have a good build process, very much like my blog, and be able to retrofit it with CSS theming using CSS custom properties and LESS CSS, which is my CSS preprocessor of choice. So imagine that this page here represents a legacy application, and it has global styles, and it has these two different CSS components, these two widgets, and I want to be able to theme them. So here we have our light theme, which is also our default theme, and you can see here that's driven by this HTML attribute, data theme, data set here, value, and I can switch over to dark theme, and you can see the HTML data set property there switches to dark, and we have both a global experience for the dark theme as well as a widget or component level experience for that dark theme. So I'll go back and forth here so you can see the light and the dark. And I have transitions on these properties just to make the demo a little bit more meaningful. Normally I wouldn't have a 1 second animation transition time. That'd be nuts. So let's take a look at how this works. And remember again that I'm talking about a legacy app that doesn't have a good build process, so I'm probably not able to use all of the modern bells and whistles that would come with something like Webpack or Post CSS processors that would be able to help me with some of this technique. So here's my HTML file, and we're going to be including this legacy CSS, which is actually being built from a LESS CSS file, which we'll take a look at in a second. Here's our theme switcher, and you can see my click handler here. I'm getting the themes. I'm looking at the target to see if it has a theme name, right? So which is these values here. And then I'm just going up to the document element, which is the HTML element, and I'm setting the dataset value theme to the selected theme, and that's why we're getting the different values here in the HTML element. Now I'm going to use this attribute as a contextual selector in my CSS to drive the theming of the various parts of the legacy application. So let's jump into our legacy CSS, or the LESS file that generates that legacy CSS. So the first thing we do here is define a LESS CSS mixin, and what that's going to do is dual write a given CSS property. The first value is going to be a static variable evaluation, a static LESS CSS variable evaluation, and the second property here is going to be using CSS custom properties. So if we jump back over into the HTML and we look at our widget, for example, what we can see if we look at the actual CSS at runtime is that we end up dual writing several values. So for example, here's our background color. You can see it's dual written as both a static value as well as a dynamic value. Same with color. It starts out as a static value and changes to a dynamic value. And what that allows us to do is then support legacy browsers, which will understand the static value, but will ignore the not understood dynamic property, giving them essentially the fallback to the light theme of the application. So for those of us who still support IE11, which will never support CSS custom properties, we have this static value to start with. Now, in LESS CSS, this global mixin can be consumed lower down in my CSS selectors, in my various nested style blocks, which means that I can use this both at a global level but also at a CSS component level. Now, we then define a couple of global LESS CSS values, and the global CSS, the LESS CSS values are used both in invocation of the var mixin, but also to define the default theme for the CSS custom properties. So it's a little bit more work here because we essentially have to dual define a couple of variables, but the overall effect again is that we get to support a legacy browser without having the niceties of something like a CSS post processor. And we can see here that of course we're defining our CSS custom properties, and then for the dark theme, we're just changing those same CSS custom properties to have different values. The approach generally taken with CSS custom properties is that you change the property value, you don't change the properties used lower down in the application. So for example, on our HTML here, you can see I'm using the var mixin to write the background color property using the LESS CSS property, LESS CSS variable, which again is what we're seeing here, which dual writes the static value followed by the dynamic runtime value. And then again, you can see that I'm hiding this themer, which is these tools here, by default, right, display none, and then for browsers that understand both the supports construct as well as the CSS custom property construct, we change that to block. So people who are using a legacy browser like IE11 won't see that theme by default. They'll be trapped essentially in the light theme and they won't be given the option to switch to the dark theme, which is pretty great for a legacy browser because you still get the good experience even though you can't have the dynamic runtime changing of the theme. And then we're just going to go ahead and import the various CSS properties for our different components, right? We have our legacy widget here and our legacy thinger. And let's jump over into widget. Widget here defines some local LESS CSS variables. Now the way CSS variables work in LESS CSS is that when you define a variable inside of a style block, they're local to that style block, which means that these variables aren't leaking out into the parent context. And that works very much the same way as the CSS custom properties, meaning that the CSS custom properties that I'm defining inside this widget contextually to a given theme, those are also local essentially to this style block. And that's really one of the beautiful things about LESS CSS is that its variables work very, very much like all of the other properties and property behaviors in regular CSS. So local LESS CSS variables, local CSS custom properties, and again we're using this mixin here to dual write the background color using both the LESS CSS property, which I'm LESS CSS variable, which I'm using here, as well as the dynamic CSS custom property at runtime, which again, if we look at our widget here, you can see we have our static value, our dynamic value, and then we have our CSS custom properties defined locally at that level of the application, which will change, right? So here we have E0 and 00, and if I go to dark, you can see these are now being 3.3 and DA, right? These are changing dynamically at runtime. And then our thinger is more of the same. We have local LESS CSS variables, we have local CSS custom properties, and then we're using our var mixin to define those CSS properties both using the static value as well as the dynamic runtime value. Now, the one nice thing to see here is that we're using not only the locally defined values, background color and border color, we're also consuming the global color, right, which is what we defined here in our main legacy.less file. So the var mixin is able to consume both variables in the calling context as well as variables in the declaration context that the var was declared in. And pretty, I just love LESS CSS. I think it's a very powerful preprocessor. And I can't stand it when people argue that CSS custom properties somehow replace CSS preprocessors. You can clearly see here in this demo that these two concepts work hand in hand. They aren't replacements for each other. Anyway, you know, in a modern application like an Angular application, we have the ability of, or we have the benefit of having a really powerful compiler and a build process, Webpack, and all that jazz. And we don't have to jump through so many hoops, and we have all kinds of access to just interesting build techniques. But when we're dealing with a legacy application that has a lot of code in place, probably code that isn't really built well or doesn't have a really modern build process, we don't necessarily get to leverage all of those modern conveniences. So in a case like that, I think using this type of approach where it's a little bit more elbow grease, right? We have to, define our LESS CSS variables, then we have to use those variables to define a default theme so that we can then dual write properties in a way that gives us legacy browser support, right? It's a little bit more work, no doubt, but it ends up being quite a nice user experience for people who are on browsers that don't necessarily support all of the new hotness that us engineers have access to. So again, just my noodling on this topic. Going to be my approach for at least my blog as I consider adding some sort of theming for funsies. And yeah, anyway, loving CSS custom properties, always loving LESS CSS, super powerful preprocessor, and hopefully it's interesting.